Larry, what was your experience of the AIDS crisis like?
Well, it was very multifaceted and huge. It was, first of all, that I was a social worker at Watsonville Hospital in the late 80s, and the first few cases from Watsonville area came through Watsonville Hospital, and I was the front person for those patients and their families. So that was very challenging and heavy for me. But also, I had friends that were dying of AIDS in my personal life, and then I decided to become a volunteer with SCAP.
Can you tell me about what the cases in Watsonville were like? What were the demographics like?
Sure. And very interesting. I distinctly remember two. The first patient we had was a young gay man, openly gay, probably 25 at the most, and he lived his whole life in Watsonville, and he was part of a prominent business family in Watsonville, and his mother was super supportive, and she was there all the time. It was touching and sad. He didn't die at that point, but I remember very distinctly his arrival at the hospital and his diagnosis, and being the one that guided both he and his mother in particular toward resources and getting home. The other patient was a Latino who had been an IV drug user, and he was less connected to his family. He had a lot of social issues, and it was harder to get his family on board to support him. But I do remember, you know, he's from a fairly large family, and I remember a couple of his siblings stepped in while he was in the hospital, and he went home to family when he had not been living with his family. So I was kind of the go-to person at Watsonville Hospital, and there were other patients who came and went in the few years that I was there in the late 80s, and then I came back to work there in '92, and there weren't as many AIDS patients coming through at that point.
What was it like being a social worker encountering HIV and AIDS, and then in your personal life also encountering HIV and AIDS?
Well, needless to say, it was very emotional. And as a trained social worker with a master's degree and many years of experience, I had always prided myself on separating the work from my own emotions and the work from my personal life. But I would come home pretty devastated at times and talk to my partner, and it was hard. It was hard. And the harder part for me was the personal losses, because the hospital and my training really made it possible for me to not get emotionally involved. But in the course of starting in about '83, friend after friend, because I had lived in Santa Cruz since the early '70s, friend after friend was getting sick, people were dying. I became afraid to have sex. I mean, it was a very rough time, and I wasn't with a steady partner at that time, so it was scary.
Can you tell me about this fear to have sex?
Well, early on, it was hard for the scientists and the researchers to identify how HIV was spread. So, I mean, they talked about toilet seats, they talked about kissing, being verboten, being in the same room with people, and let alone being intimate. And so I was very shut down for a few years until it became clear that the primary source of transmission for gay men was anal sex, the recipient of anal sex. And so I then was able to resume being sexual without doing that. So, but it was very scary. I mean, I was in my 30s, and it was frightening. So you never knew, the roll of the dice kind of thing. And I did have a boyfriend who then contracted HIV, and he died. And he was not super close to me, but he had been somebody I'd dated for 6 months, and 2 other men that I had dated who died. I think about those guys, you know, died in the prime of their lives.
Can you tell me about them?
Oh boy, yeah, the first 2 guys were here in Santa Cruz. I dated both of them at the same time because I was wild and loose in that era of my life. One of them was a housemate of mine, and he was estranged from his family, and he was kind of a wild guy, much more wild than me. And he was white. The other guy was a black guy who had been a dancer and was a student at UCSC. And he was such a beautiful, heartfelt guy, and it was just tragic that he got sick. And I wasn't with him by the time he passed. He had moved back to be with his family. So I never really experienced that kind of loss. But I then dated a guy in San Francisco who got sick while I was dating him. And it was shocking and scary. I was afraid that I might have gotten infected. But more so, the guys that I lost were close friends. And one after the next, for probably 8 years or 10 years. It was till the cocktail came out in the early, like 93 or whatever that year was. It was really hard. I mean, I can't even describe it.
How many friends do you think you lost in that period?
I was thinking about this in preparation for this interview, and I thought probably 25 friends. I mean, I'm a very social person. I always have been, and I had a lot of friends through just being part of the gay world here. And I was one of the founders of the Gay Pride Parade, and I was very involved in the community. So to lose friend after friend, most of them men in their 20s, it was so overwhelming. And when I got together with my partner, who I'm still with, my husband, you know, we felt so supported by each other, and we could have sex freely because we were both HIV negative. Such a difference between guys that I had dated, guys I wanted to date, and so many close friends.
How do you think losing at least 25 friends impacted you?
Well, first of all, I was working as a social worker, and you know, I had learned, as I said before, how to separate my professional life from my personal life. But when I started keeping a journal, not really a journal, but a list of people who had died, who were in my sphere of friendship, it was scary and sad and overwhelming, and I was afraid. So there was a lot of emotion in there for a few years until I was able to be tested and knew that I was negative and knew how the virus was transmitted. But I just can't tell you how many friends, oh, this waiter over here who I knew for years, he died. What? You know, it was so shocking at times because I had a lot of friends, but I didn't keep in touch with all of them all the time. I traveled with a guy who died like 6 months later. I mean, he and I spent a month traveling, but I already knew he was positive. It made me want to hide other than work. It really kept me as shut down as possible because it was painful. It was really painful.
How did you reemerge after being shut down?
Well, basically I started volunteering for SCAP, which was a big thing. SCAP was new in the mid-'80s, and I was working at the hospital in Watsonville, but I felt like I needed to do something for my community more personally, and so I became a volunteer at SCAP, and that was a great support for me and an outlet for me, and I was able to, I led support groups for SCAP for a couple of years for survivors and also for partners of people with AIDS, so 2 different kind of support groups. And you know, that was like weekly or every 2 weeks, and I felt like I was able to give of myself, and in addition to that, I was a buddy, and that's what they called them. I was a buddy at SCAP because I had all these skills, and the buddy meant that I was like a friendly visitor to a particular guy who was sick, and he lived very close to my house. And the one memory I have, which is really kind of crazy, is I was visiting him while he was in the hospital in 1989 when the earthquake hit. In Santa Cruz and the whole Bay Area had this giant earthquake, and I was in his room on Frederick Street at the old community hospital. This was on my own time, and I was there at his bedside, and he was in an isolation room, and the whole building shook, and the picture window crashed into the room, and the television fell off of the wall onto the floor, and I'm holding his hand, and I'm saying, his name was David, David, and I'll never forget it, you know, David, it's an earthquake, you're gonna be okay, you're gonna be okay, and I tried to dive under the bed, but hospital beds don't really have space for that, and it was just one of the added crazinesses of that time for me, personally.
What was it like being a survivor, leading a support group for other survivors?
Wow, phew, that's a tough question. I was grateful, of course, to be able to do that work. I had not lost a partner, so the 2 partners I'd had in the early and mid-'80s were both healthy and both turned out to be negative, and I had like 3-year relationships with each of them. But the sense of helping guys whose partners were dying was surreal. It was really surreal. And then also the guys who had lost their partners, some of whom I knew. I mean, I knew quite a few of these men, and somehow I could still keep my center and my distance, but it was really hard. It was really hard. And going to see the guy who I was his buddy was a little lighter because he was not in my world. He was lived in a funky place, and he was like practically on the streets at times, and he had a partner who was, you know, they were like arguing all the time, and it wasn't my life. And I could go there and I could bring him food, or I could take him out or take him to a doctor's appointment, and it wasn't, it didn't have an emotional impact on me.
What did have an emotional impact on you?
Oh, particular men who died, including, I mean, it went on for years. So my very best friend, Dennis, got sick probably in 1990 or maybe 89, and he was in and out of the hospital a few times, and he was, other than a partner, he was the love of my life, my best friend. And I remember so well visiting him when he was getting sicker, and when he died, he had a new partner who hung in there with him. But I was with Tom by then, my husband, and I remember getting the call to go to Dominican Hospital because he was dying, and we were there when he passed. And as much as I tried to divorce myself from the emotion because of my social work training, it was it was not possible. And I was pretty devastated. He didn't die till 94, right before the cocktail kind of came out. And I remember him so well for so many things. He was in theater, he was a singer, he was a comedian, he was just all these great things. And to lose him, and he was like 32 or 34 when he died. And what potential to lose, you know. It was the hardest. And I did lose other boyfriends and other close friends, but Dennis was the hardest.
How do you think Santa Cruz would be different if we hadn't lost Dennis and all your friends and all those people?
Wow. Well, first of all, there would have been a lot more volunteers for many things. But so many of these men had such rich lives and rich connection in our community. And, you know, in the late 70s, I came out in the mid 70s, and the gay men's community was fairly small, and it started growing, and we had the first Pride, which I was on the committee that put that Pride together, and it was the first like visible, like, yeah, there's a real community here of men and women. And the AIDS crisis and the whole AIDS epidemic didn't start for some years after that. A lot of these men would have been part of the early community. I mean, and some of them were, and a lot of them had their private lives, and I didn't know them all that well, but then as people got sicker, I got to know a lot more of them. It was a really huge loss to Santa Cruz and Santa Cruz County to lose so many young, vital men, including, other men that I worked with, other men that I had sex with, other men that I did cocaine with in the day, you know. I worked at a restaurant as a waiter, and a couple of the guys I worked with got sick and died. That was here. I mean, just, it was, I would never imagined that it would have been so hard, and it was very hard.
What do you wish people born after the AIDS crisis knew about it?
Well, there was a lot of pain. So a lot of the younger people didn't experience that. But I think that this whole history, which is part of what you're doing here, with people like me who lived through it and who are still alive and who are still in Santa Cruz, or Santa Cruz County, we have a lot to educate young people about who didn't realize the impact, or who never lost anybody to this disease, let alone the whole sexual component, which is a big thing, because yes, we all started using condoms, but then younger people moved on from condoms, and this whole barebacking thing started to happen, and then, you know, more recently, of course, the whole PrEP medication. That is a miracle, quite frankly, but I think for young people who grew up after the AIDS crisis, they don't have that sense of the impact of the grief, the loss, the sadness, the missing people in our community. There are so many holes that will never be refilled, especially my generation.
Can you tell me more about that impact?
So 10 years ago, actually 9 years ago, the 40th anniversary of Pride was put together, and I was very involved in that. And my husband, Tom, who I've been with for 30-something years, he got an idea to create this 2 big posters with photos and names of people, and obituaries, if they were available, of people who had died during those years. And we displayed it at Pride, and it had a booth after the Pride parade, And I worked with him to put all this together. We were searching for photos, we were searching for obituaries, and it was like, oh my God, this person, right? I remember that person, and I remember this person, and don't forget that person. And it was a great project for him and I to do, and it was very emotional. And then at that Pride Day, we had these yellow stickies that people could write a name of somebody else who we had not even remembered. And even a few women wrote names of women who had died of not AIDS, but had died and we had lost them. And so women got more involved, but of course the women had been really involved during the SCAP years and the AIDS crisis. But I'll just tell you that project, which we held on to at our house for a number of years, a collage, I guess you would say, of all these people, and having photos. We didn't have everybody's photos or obituaries, which we had even less of, but it was another layer, after being away from it for so many years, I mean a couple of decades, to relive it and remember was powerful. It was emotional. I hurt a lot during that time, during making that project, because most of what we were doing was celebrating and parade, and we had a big reunion gathering of the original trailblazers, we were called, who were all around during the mid-70s when the first Pride happened, 1975. But it was just painful. It was painful to go back, and yet proud. Tom and I both felt so proud of honoring all these people and having them on display at a booth at Pride was really touching and powerful.
What do you think Santa Cruz Pride would be like if those folks were there?
Wow. Oh, man. Well, it'd be a lot bigger, for sure. And, you know, more vital. Nowadays, I mean, I probably am the only person left in Santa Cruz from the first Pride planning committee. But there are still a lot of us who marched in that early parade and did this whole, it was a picnic and a tug of war in San Lorenzo Park. It was a beautiful thing. But there were maybe 200 people, and now you see how big the parade is. Well, if you could add on those, just the 30 or 40 people who I might have touched in my life, let alone all the people that I wasn't really connected to. Hence that 2 bulletin boards full of names and faces. It would be bigger, that's for sure, and more powerful. And of course the whole parade changed over the years because it was just all fun, and then AIDS came along, and then it was much more somber. The parades had posters of people who had died, and you know, SCAP was a presence, and all of that impact was so strong that it really changed the parade for probably 10 years before people started to lighten up again.
So the parade was very serious for about a decade?
It was. I would say 6 or 8 years for sure, because people were dying all the time. Maybe 10 years until we as a community kind of moved on. Although obviously partners of people who died and they were still here, they didn't move on so easily. But yes, the parade and the whole community had a more somber tone for maybe a decade. I became a buddy at SCAP, and because I had been in the social work field for so long, including working for like a visiting nurses agency, I had done a lot of home visits and seeing how people lived, and I was always fascinated by that work. And so going into someone's house who was HIV, and of course there was always the scary part of it, But we wore masks, and I cleaned a toilet or two, and I did shopping, and I did laundry and cooking. That was, for me, was kind of fun. And that was being part of SCAP, but not having any big responsibility. Then I started doing the support groups, or maybe I started doing the support groups first, where I was leading or co-leading a couple of different support groups, and I really appreciated the support from the professional staff at SCAP. And as the HIV epidemic continued to get bigger and unfold, I found that SCAP really got their stuff together. They were kind of fly by night at the beginning, but the dedication and the professionalism of the staff was awesome. And it made me really proud to be affiliated with them and doing work with them. Proud, you know, really being able to give back to my community on a certain level, whether it was the support groups or I probably had 4 different buddies, but the one I most distinctly remembered was a guy named David, because I did work with him as a friend for quite a long time, and then he did pass away. And the other guys that I also worked with passed away. I mean, this was what was going on. So SCAP was a godsend. It was a godsend for the whole community and for me personally.
Was working with SCAP part of your coping with the AIDS crisis?
Yes, for sure. Because I didn't want to feel powerless, and I wanted to help, and I was, I tested negative, I don't remember when, but as soon as the testing was available, and because I was working full time, it was a way I could work an evening or a weekend and help, and not just feel like I was losing everybody and I couldn't do anything. I could do something.
What motivated you to take on all that extra volunteer responsibility?
Well, losing friends. I mean, one after the next for a period of years. It was hard, and I'm a giver, and I'm a person that likes to do service. I mean, my whole life, I was a waiter for many years, and being a social worker in certain environments was all about caring and giving and serving. So that was coming from my heart.
What lessons did you take from the AIDS crisis?
I guess that it's really important to give back. It's really important to be part of a community and not just isolate. That despite losses, there's reason to go on, and it made me stronger. I felt empowered by being able to do this work.
Before we go, is there anything else that you'd like to add?
Well, I think there was just the history of what I can impart to young people today. And there's safe sex, but there's also the PrEP, so that doesn't become so much of an issue. But there are especially people that are not white gay men who are really needing education, who need support, and for younger people, not to take everything for granted and feel like you're immortal, because you're not. And your life as a young person can change on a dime, whether it's HIV or not, because mostly it isn't anymore. But to be able to give of yourself, to be safe, and give to our community, because the LGBTQ plus community is so vital and so important, and so in need of volunteers. So I think that's what I'm thinking of right now.
Yeah, our community is pretty hard fought.
Yeah, because we keep getting hit and keep bouncing back, especially for trans people. You know, it's really rough.
Do you see any parallels between what's happening for the trans community and what happened during the AIDS crisis?
Oh yeah. People with AIDS were ostracized. They were oppressed. They were the victims of legislation. They were the victims of homophobia. People didn't understand. Families rejected their sons in particular who had gotten sick. And for trans people, young especially, trans people and people on that spectrum, they need all the support they can get. And I'm sure that a lot of families are rejecting their kids, and all the anti-trans legislation that's going on in our country. I mean, it's 2 steps forward, but it's 1 step or 2 steps back. So I think I applaud the fight, and I'm still fighting also. And I think I'll leave it at that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.